Hello and welcome to Lesson 1 on hazards. In this topic, we're going to look at different types of hazards, and it's split between tectonic hazards and also climatic hazards as well. We're also going to look at how different hazards affect people and communities, and also how different countries respond to hazards. So let's start off by defining what a natural hazard is. So a natural hazard can be defined as a threat of a naturally occurring event that may have a negative effect on people or the environment. So it's that threat. Now, there's two types of hazards, or two main types of hazards. We have tectonic over here. This includes things like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and also tsunamis. And we also have climatic hazards over here. This includes hurricanes, also known as typhoons or cyclones. Also includes flooding, drought, and heat waves. Now, just to clarify, hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones are all the same thing. The reason they're called these different names is due to the different regions they're found in. So, for example, in the US and Caribbean, they're called hurricanes, and in Australia and South Asia, so like India, Bangladesh, they're called cyclones, and in East and Southeast Asia, they're called typhoons. There's also a few other types of hazards, such as biological hazards, that will include things like diseases, epidemics, pandemics, so like COVID-19. And then there's also human-induced hazards, so hazards caused by human activity. For example, you might have heard of the Chernobyl disaster, which was a big nuclear power plant explosion. It's also oil spills and global warming. But in this topic, we're going to focus on what you can call the two main types of natural hazards, and that's definitely tectonic and climatic. So there's a few factors that affect hazard risk. Now, let's define what we actually mean by hazard risk. Now, I've got some key term definitions here. So risk is the probability of a hazard event causing harmful consequences. That can include things like death, injury, loss of property, damage to the environment, etc. So it's that probability of a hazard causing harmful consequences. Now, there's several factors that affect hazard risk. First of all, we have geographic location. Now, where you might be located in the world will affect your risk to certain hazards. For example, if you lived in Japan, you would be more at risk than if you lived in the UK, because Japan is an area where that's very prone to many different types of hazards, including earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis as well, typhoons as they're known in that part of the world as well. So depending on where you are in the world, so your geographic location will affect your hazard risk. Now, another factor is population size and density. So how big a city or country's population is, and also how densely populated a place is, so how crowded it is. So you might have guessed that, you know, the higher the population density, or the bigger the population, or the more crowded a place is, the more or the higher hazard risk that place will have, because there's more people in harm's way. Another factor is magnitude of a hazard. Now, what do we mean by magnitude? The magnitude is defined as the scale or intensity of a hazard event. So how strong or intense it is. So you might have heard of earthquakes being, you know, like magnitude 9.3 or like 7.0 or something like that. That is a measure of their strength, their intensity. So you might have guessed the higher the magnitude, the higher the hazard risk. Another factor is frequency. Now, the frequency of a hazard event is how often that hazard event occurs over time. And of course, the higher the frequency of a certain hazard, the higher the risk as well. There's another factor called speed of onset. Now, speed of onset is how quickly a certain hazard happens and then continues to occur over time. So for example, an earthquake has a very rapid speed of onset. You can't really see it coming. It happens very suddenly, and you know, you can't really predict it. Whereas hurricanes, for example, you can kind of predict those. You can see them coming, so their speed of onset is a bit slower. So the faster the speed of onset, the higher the hazard risk as well. And finally, level of development of a country or region is another factor affecting hazard risk. The more developed or the wealthier country or region is, the lower the hazard risk, because more money can be spent on trying to reduce the risk through, you know, things like earthquake-resistant buildings, for example, or, you know, spending money on really good education to educate people and raise awareness of what to do in the event of a hazard to minimize risk, or, you know, having good planning in place, you know, like earthquake drills and good like emergency response and so on. So the more developed a country or region, the lower the risk generally. Now, it's worth also distinguishing between a hazard and a disaster, because they're not the same thing. A natural hazard is not always automatically a disaster. A hazard, we said, was the threat of an event. A hazard only becomes a disaster when you have significant loss of some sort or damage of some sort, like loss of life, injury, property damage, or environmental damage. In other words, humans have to get in the way for it to become a disaster. So, we can say a disaster is when a hazard results in significant loss or damage. Humans get in the way. So, I'll give you an example. Picture like a empty, deserted island. There's no one living there. There's no city, buildings, nothing. There's no animals. And a really strong, like magnitude 9.5 earthquake strikes that island. Even though it's a really, really powerful earthquake, very high magnitude, it's not a disaster because nothing's happened, because there was nothing there in the first place. No one died, no one got injured, no animals were affected, no buildings were damaged, because, you know, there was nothing there to start with. So a hazard only becomes a disaster when humans get in the way, when you have some kind of loss or damage or significant environmental damage as well, like, you know, animals getting killed and so on. Now, there was another term, vulnerability. So we've talked about magnitude. That was the, you know, intensity of a hazard event. Frequency, how often it occurs over time. Risk, the probability of a hazard event causing harm. And vulnerability, which is defined as the susceptibility of a community or group of people to a hazard or the impact of a hazard event. So in other words, vulnerability is a measure of how at risk populations are to natural or human hazards.